Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Aurora Institute Symposium 2020 virtual session. My name is Susan Patrick. I'm the CEO of Aurora Institute, and I'll be moderating today's session. As you may know, we've shifted our in-person symposium to a virtual convening in the wake of COVID-19. We'll be hosting a virtual symposium on October 26th through 28th, so please continue to save those dates. And we're also hosting an all-fall series of our symposium sessions that began in August and will extend through November. We hope you'll join us for the entire virtual symposium as you are able. We have more than 20 sessions over 15 weeks to learn from and participate in. Today's webinar is on the NCAA high school review process, why and how, and what's different during COVID-19. You may be asking why a college sports association would be presenting with an education innovation nonprofit organization. Did you know that the NCAA, colleges and universities have academic benchmarks for incoming prospective student athletes, including specific requirements for courses completed through online, blended, competency-based, and other such means? These are also known as the eligibility requirements. Today, we're going to be discussing the requirements for these reviews using the NCAA criteria. And we will learn about what's different between the standard requirements and temporary policies due to COVID-19. Next slide, please. So a little housekeeping. Please use the chat box to introduce yourself. We'll be using the chat to ask questions. Type in your questions throughout the webinar, make comments, and feel free to share resources and links throughout today's session. We're going to be learning from each other. We're also going to test out the Zoom functionality for Annotate. If you try this now, we'll do a quick test. Go to the top of your screen, and where it says View Options, click on that and go to Annotate. When you go to Annotate, you can hover over and select Stamp. Pick a stamp. And if you look at the mission of the Aurora Institute, click on the part of the mission that resonates with you the most. This is how you use the Annotate feature to select and post things on the slides. So try it out. At the top, View Options, Annotate, and Stamp. Great, I can see you're getting the hang of it. We'll be using this later, so thanks for testing it out. We're all about transformation here. So also, we want to make sure we're sharing out our learning on social media. If you're on social media, feel free to use hashtag Aurora2020 on Twitter and mention @Aurora_INST. This is on your screen. Please know we're recording today's webinar and we're archiving it, and it will be freely available on our website. We'll also be following up with an email so that you can directly access the links. Thanks. We'll clear the screen and move to the next slide. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters. I'm so happy to have with us three terrific people that I've had the pleasure of working with at the NCAA over the years. Sarah Overpeck is the director of the High School Review Office at the NCAA. Krista Palmer is the associate director of the Eligibility Center for the NCAA. And Kaylin Overway is the assistant director for the Eligibility Center for the NCAA. Thank you so much for investing your time and being with us to help the field learn more about NCAA reviews. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Let me just start by saying that I hope you, your families, and everyone in your communities are doing as well as possible in these unprecedented times. How many times have we all heard the word unprecedented over the last several months? But I hope that you're doing as well as possible. Thank you so much to the Aurora Institute for having us today. I'm excited to be here along with my colleagues, Krista and Kaylin. The three of us, as Susan mentioned, work in the Eligibility Center of the NCAA. And on the high school review team, we handle all pre-enrollment academic requirements for student athletes before they get to that next step as NCAA student athletes. The NCAA has a long history of partnership with the Aurora Institute as we continually work to remain both aware of and open to emerging learning models in the work that we do with prospective student athletes preparing to play college sports. So on the next slide, I'll walk you through what we have on the agenda for you today. We're going to talk about the history and the context of some of the legislation that is in play today for student athletes and their core courses. We'll talk about the types of reviews that we do on the high school review team specifically. The non-traditional program review information, which is anything from online, blended, distance learning, or any combination of those things. We'll talk about COVID-19 updates, so what we're doing in response to just the upheaval of the world right now. We'll talk about what's next with the work that we do. Obviously, there are a lot of changes happening, as there constantly are, in K through 12 and higher ed. So we'll talk about how that impacts our work and what we're doing looking forward. We'll definitely have time for questions at the end, but we will also address questions along the way. So please feel free, as Susan mentioned, to use that chat feature and ask questions as we go, and we'll have some pauses throughout to address things in the moment. So before we dive in, we're going to do a quick poll just to help us better understand who's in the audience today. Okay, looks like people are winding down. So take a look at the results here. So fairly spread out, but we do have several folks who selected other. So if anyone is feeling up to it, I'd be interested if you want to unmute and just, if you answered other, if you want to unmute and just share with us what role you most identify with as you attend this session today.
I'll unmute. Elisa Maggi, and I'm here with a colleague. We are responsible for the Nassau BOCES Center for Online Learning. And we are here today because we know it's been a long and winding road to have our program approved for NCAA, and we're very much hoping to be able to do that in the near future.
Great, thank you. All right, well, if you answered other and you don't want to unmute and share, that's fine. You can also share in the chat, but hopefully what we're going to talk about today you find relevant, and if there's any questions that you have, again, please feel free to ask those along the way. So we can go ahead and clear the poll and we'll move on to our topics. So we're going to talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, just the history and context of the NCAA as a whole and how it relates to secondary education. So to do that, we'll start with just an overview of sort of the structure of the NCAA on the next slide. So the NCAA is a membership association. Each division, divisions 1, 2, and 3 of the NCAA has their own set of legislation, including bylaws governing initial eligibility, which is our focus today. So the pre-enrollment aspect. Each division sets academic requirements that incoming student athletes must meet. Things like the number of core courses they need to complete, the GPA in those core courses, SAT or ACT benchmarks, a whole package of academic requirements that students must meet to compete in Division I or Division II sports. Division III does not have separate NCAA initial eligibility standards. Those incoming student athletes are required to meet the enrollment standards at their respective institution, which Division I and Division II student athletes also have to do, but then they have these NCAA standards as well. And then the High School Review Committee is one of these committees that guides how that work is conducted by the NCAA office staff. So it's referred to as a common committee, meaning it guides our work for both Divisions I and II. This committee is unique in that it's not only post-secondary representatives from Divisions I and II that serve on that committee, but also independent members from the secondary school community, such as teachers, principals, school founders, leaders of educational organizations, just a variety of independent secondary school representatives. These perspectives are crucial to us in ensuring that legislation and how it's put into practice are as aligned as closely as possible with innovation in the field of secondary education. So on the next slide, we'll look at how that has played out in terms of consideration of non-traditional core courses. So over 20 years ago, the only mention of any type of non-traditional core courses and their use towards student athletes' initial eligibility was specific to independent study and correspondence, pretty clearly stated that they could not be used for those purposes. Then around 1999 to 2000, in response to the growing popularity of online, blended, distance learning, and other types of similar environments, the governing groups in Divisions I and II began allowing the use of those courses with some conditions set around how those courses were administered, what students were expected to do and know. So some of those conditions are still in the existing language today, which we'll get to in a moment. Then 10 years after that, so around 2009 to 2010, NCAA staff had begun noticing some trends in student work from certain types of learning environments where students were able to complete courses in a matter of hours or days with little to no guardrails around timing, no engagement with an instructor or even with the course content itself. So the High School Review Committee, along with the review staff at the NCAA office, saw extensive feedback from secondary education practitioners, from leaders in the field, on how to best uphold the expectations of college readiness, while also not creating so many limitations that non-traditional core courses would essentially be banned. So trying to remain open to innovation while also protecting against what could be seen as maybe abuses of an online learning environment, or just not in line with the educational intent of innovation. So I want you to keep that process in mind of revisiting legislation and gathering feedback, because we're going to touch on it again toward the end of the presentation when we talk about what's next for the work of the Eligibility Center and the High School Review staff. But for now, I'll hand it over to Krista, who will talk about the specifics of where we are today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. So like Sarah said, Sarah, Kaylin, and I work on a team called High School Review in the Eligibility Center. And many of us on the team, like Sarah, Kaylin, and myself, are former high school teachers and administrators. I see a couple more of us from the High School Review team on the call. So hi, Amy. Hi, Brian. Those of you who answered your teachers and administrators, you're in familiar and good company. So thanks for joining us. As the High School Review team, we're responsible for reviewing high school accounts, high school programs, and high school courses to ensure that student athletes are academically prepared for four-year colleges and universities. So on the next slide, you can see the different types of reviews that the High School Review team does. Any high school that's registered with the NCAA Eligibility Center who wishes to have its courses used for their students in the certification process must go through what we call the account review process. As part of that process, we gather a lot of information from schools about school policies and operations, as well as their curriculum, their instruction, and assessment practices in order to determine an appropriate account status. The most common and most favorable outcome of those types of reviews is what we call the cleared status, in which courses and proof of graduation can be used from the high schools in the student's eligibility certifications. So either as part of that process or after the high school has gone through the account review process and been given a status of cleared or sometimes extended evaluation, we review the instructional models at those high schools, or what we call programs, according to NCAA legislation. And Kaylin will actually cover the non-traditional core course legislation shortly. In addition to high school accounts and high school programs, our team also reviews individual courses according to set criteria for review to ensure that courses that are used in the process for student athletes are college preparatory in both content and rigor. So just as a reminder, these would be courses in the areas of English, math, social science, science, and then world language, comparative religion, or philosophy. If you want to read more in detail about the criteria for review and the policies and procedures associated with all of these different types of reviews that our team does, you can find that by the link on this screen, but also accessing the High School Review Committee policies and procedures, which I think Sarah will include in the chat box if she hasn't already. So with that, just a brief overview of the types of account, program, and course reviews. I will kick it over to Kaylin, who will talk in depth about the non-traditional core course legislation.
Thanks, Krista. So on the next slide, we can go ahead and start. So as Sarah said, for the NCAA's purposes, non-traditional courses include those that are taught online, blended or hybrid, independent study, correspondence, or other similar means. And when we review non-traditional courses and programs, we do so by reviewing the program as a whole and not the work done by individual students. And on the next slide, we'll go ahead and view the non-traditional core course legislation. So in order for a non-traditional program to meet the NCAA non-traditional core course legislation, the programs must have the following: courses that meet all requirements for NCAA core courses, which is what Krista just mentioned. These programs must have regular and ongoing student and teacher interaction for the purposes of instruction, evaluation, and assistance for the duration of the course. And I'll talk a little more about that momentarily. These programs also have to have student work available for evaluation and validation, the appropriate academic authorities evaluating student work, a defined time period for completion, and I'll talk more about that one as well. And then finally, these programs must have courses that are acceptable for all students, and these courses will be put on the student's high school transcript. And if we click again, we've underlined the two pieces of legislation we most often cite as reasons for not approving a program: the student-teacher interaction and the defined time period for completion. First, the student-teacher interaction must be regular and ongoing for those three purposes I mentioned earlier: teaching, evaluation, and assistance throughout the entire course. So to be considered regular, when we review these, we look for a pattern of required interactions with all students, even those students that don't seek out the help or may not have questions that they need to ask. We have seen schools meet this piece of the legislation in a variety of ways, including requiring a time-based instruction, so having students meet with instructors once a week to receive content instruction, or content-based parameters such as meeting once a unit or meeting before all end-of-unit assessments, things like that. We've also seen schools meet this component by requiring teachers to provide instructive feedback after assignments and assessments. In this case, we look for regular, specific instructional feedback that extends the learning for students, so more than just a good job, but instead includes specific information on what the student did well, as well as how the student can improve. The other piece, the defined time period for completion that we cite most often, is because schools will have a maximum time frame for completion for their non-traditional courses, but they don't always have a minimum time frame established. We don't say what that minimum time frame has to be, but that your school has the has a time frame established in which students must spend at least that amount of time working on their non-traditional course. Lastly, we look at how these components fit together. So for example, if a student must meet with a teacher every 3 weeks for content instruction, and the minimum time frame is 1 week, we would ask additional questions about the student-teacher interaction and how it occurs throughout the course, if the student could potentially complete the course prior to that set required interaction. So those are the two big things that we see for non-traditional courses. And I think this is a good time that if anybody has any questions specific to the non-traditional core course legislation, feel free to put those in the chat box.
So there's a great question from Jeff Simmons that comes up frequently that says, how does the NCAA Eligibility Center evaluate a defined time period for a mastery course?
Yeah, that is a great question. And Krista and Sarah, feel free to jump in as well if you'd like. So for mastery, we do still require those defined minimum timeframes. And like I said, it doesn't have we don't have a set time. There's no requirement of 3 weeks or 1 week or whatever. It's what you have set for a course as far as how long a student must be working in that course.
This is Krista. I can add to that just a little bit, and Sarah, feel free if you would like to as well. This is one of those classic "it depends" answers from the NCAA. So it depends how the course is implemented. So if it falls more into the online category, we would put it in the non-traditional bucket where we would require all of these things that Kaylin just talked about. If it's the in-person, face-to-face instructional model, it doesn't have to meet the non-traditional core course requirements, as Kaylin just talked about. So it depends. It's kind of that gray area where we have to look at each program individually and see what the parameters are and how it's implemented. Sarah, I don't know if there's anything else you would want to add there.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. So one thing that we sometimes ask schools to, it's almost like a thought exercise, is in your competency-based or mastery-based environment, what is the absolute fastest, assuming everything went as smoothly as possible, even if you don't say to a student, you need to be enrolled in this course for an 18-week semester, given all of the other guardrails that you have in place in your program, like how frequently they need to meet with a teacher, how frequently they need to interact with a discussion board, or whatever those things look like in your program. And the best case scenario, what is the fastest a student could get through it? And is there a point at which you would say, you're not progressing as we expected, we need to adjust here, and maybe there's a response to intervention protocol, or just different things that are very, very specific to your program. We would get into those types of details. So there's a lot of opportunities throughout the review process to ask those questions and have schools respond. So hopefully that kind of answers the question. I will say that the NCAA legislation for students themselves is very time-based, so we can't get away from it entirely. Students have, we'll talk later about the core course time limitation that students have. They have to complete their courses within a certain amount of time and meet certain time-based benchmarks along the way. So we can't get away from it entirely, unfortunately, but we try to just understand how it works in your specific program.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction too. There's a lot of appreciation in the chat for just being able to understand this more deeply. And I'll say, in full disclosure, had served as a member and now an ex officio member of the high school review committee. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness that goes into understanding and working to understand that in these innovative high school models, there can be different pacing. And the question is really around, and you lifted this up, but I just want to emphasize it. What is your policy for your program? And you're trying to be really thoughtful about, this isn't one size fits all, but you need to articulate to us, what is your policy? How do you set up pacing guides? What are your expectations? Make that clear. And you see from the questions is, what is the time frame defined? Well, do you have a program that's intense, like I'll give the example of like summer school where it's 3.5 weeks, right? Or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, or is there an expectation that spans over 9 weeks or an entire year or even less time? What is that? What are the expectations? So really focus on identifying the policies and having clear policies and adhering to them too. So thank you for that answer. I think it's helpful. Corey has a follow-up. Is the time frame defined in order to receive credit for the entire course, or the time frame to receive quarter credit in a course? And again, I think the answer to that is in the policy, but I'll just get some clarification there.
I can take this one too. So we ask in the review process what those timeframes are as far as how you set up the course. So if you tell us it's a semester course, you can give us the semester time frame that you require. Same thing with quarters. If it's a quarter credit, you can tell us how long it would take to complete the quarter. Or if schools give 1 credit at the end of the entire course, you can give us the time frame to complete the entire course. So like Sarah was saying, we hopefully leave a lot of opportunity in the review process to let schools explain how their programs work. So depending on the individual situation, we'll try to get to the bottom of it, but it just depends.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So another question on how do you work with self-paced programs?
Yeah, I can take this one. So the self-paced programs are very similar. They, especially for the online, if they meet that non-traditional component, then they still need that defined time period for completion. And so we'll ask some kind of follow-up questions regarding what's the fastest that you would allow a student to complete the course, and may even get into how fast has a student completed a course at your school previously, and would you allow them to finish it faster than that?
Great, thank you.
All right, I think that is all for non-traditional courses. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks.
Right, thanks, Kaylin. So I'm going to talk about some of the response that, not just to this process, but a couple of other kind of major updates that the NCAA Eligibility Center has made in response to the pandemic, and just how that has obviously had a huge impact on student athletes, how their prospective student athletes who might be trying to enter Division I or Division II colleges, how they're learning in this environment, what the expectations of them are, and the ability of them to take the SAT or the ACT. So obviously a lot going on. We started these discussions in the Eligibility Center about how to respond to all of this as soon as the middle of March. So we started gathering feedback from people, just questions that people were sending into our customer service center, questions and concerns that each of the staff members were hearing from contacts that we have. And we started just developing sort of a list of trends that we were hearing. And from there, along with our research staff at the NCAA, as well as just an understanding of what's going on in the field currently of education, we developed some changes or updates, some temporary and some that are affecting students who are taking courses now but aren't necessarily going to enroll in college right now. Maybe they're freshmen, sophomores, juniors. So I will, on the next slide, give you just an overview of what those look like, and then we'll dive into each one. So these, again, this is just some main changes that we've made that are sort of most likely to have the broadest impact to the audience here today, but there's additional, more nuanced situations that are covered in the full FAQ document, which is at the bottom of the slide, and then I'll also put it in a link to it in the chat. So I've kind of broken these into 2 sections. The first 2 main items that we're going to cover is for students initially enrolling full-time in a Division I or Division II college in the 2021 or 2021 to 22 academic year. So Typically, this would be current high school seniors or incoming high school seniors who are expecting to graduate on time and then expecting to enroll in the following fall. Of course, nothing is typical right now. So these would also apply to students maybe who have already graduated and are delaying their enrollment until the fall of 21 or until the winter of 21. So this is based not just on high school graduation date, but on enrollment in Division I or Division II date. So we'll cover the waiver criteria for those situations, and then the core course time limitation updates for those students. And then we'll also talk about two main topics for students that are taking high school courses during the current academic year, no matter when they're going to enroll. So like I said, this could be freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors who are not going to enroll for in college until several years from now. And those two items are pass-fail grades. And that was something we heard a lot in the spring of schools converting to pass-fail grades who didn't typically offer that grading system, but felt that was the fairest thing to do when there was sort of a sudden emergency response or emergency remote instruction. And then we'll also talk about the response to distance e-learning and hybrid models that we're seeing right now. So on the next slide, we'll start digging into these in a little more detail. So for the initial eligibility waiver criteria, and again, this is for students who are enrolling in college in 2021-22 academic year. I mentioned several slides ago about how Division I and Division II have their own sets of requirements for each division. So they're pretty similar, but just slightly different in terms of what students need to complete to be academically eligible. This waiver criteria in terms of the core courses and the GPA and how it's broken down, that is the regular criteria. So the only difference here is that there's no mention on the slide of SAT or ACT scores. So that is the waiver component. If students are unable due to access or whatever reason, they're unable to take an SAT or ACT test, that requirement can be waived for this population of students. So they still need to meet the 16 core course requirement with the GPA requirements that you see there in those core courses. For each division, there's a specific distribution across English, math, natural, physical science, social science, and additional. And these are available. I'll drop another link in the chat in a little bit so you can look at the actual requirements. For Division I, 10 core courses have to be completed before the start of the 7th semester. 7 of those have to be in English, math, or natural or physical science. And then they have to provide proof of graduation. So if all those GPA core course requirements are met and the student has graduated, then they are eligible for this waiver, which means that they don't need to have an SAT or ACT test score. So typically they would have certain test requirements as well. But if they meet these requirements, then this waiver would be approved and they would essentially what we call a full qualifier. So they would have availability of athletic scholarships. They would be able to practice in that first year of college enrollment, and they would be able to compete in the first year of college enrollment. So again, the main difference here is that waiving of the SAT or ACT requirement. We might get this question, so I can just address it now, is that I do not know whether that's going to be something that's permanent. You know, the lack of or optional nature of an SAT or ACT score in the future requirements. That's something our research staff continues to look at. So that's all I can tell you at this point, if that was something that was a burning question on your mind. On the next slide, we will talk about the core course time limitation. So again, for students enrolling in full-time in 2021 or 22, they can complete up to 6 core courses anytime after the start of their 7th semester and use those toward their initial eligibility certification. So what this does essentially is just removes the need for them to complete those final 6 courses before they graduate. So there might be, they already have to complete 10 before the start of their 7th semester for Division I, but if they need some extended time because they've transition to a different learning model or learning environment that they're not used to, or they have different needs and need to extend their learning into the summer. This allows students to do that for Division I. Now for Division II, this is already allowed. So students can already complete any number of core courses prior to the start of their full-time enrollment, and those will be considered in the best 16 core courses across that subject area distribution that we talked about. So the main difference here is for Division I, and it just extends the amount of time afforded for those students to complete those final requirements, given the nature of just the upheavals and changes in learning environments right now. Now on the next slide, we'll start talking about the updates that affect not just students enrolling in a specific time, but anyone taking high school classes right now. So for pass-fail grades, typically, if a student takes a course as pass-fail, but all their other courses at that school are, letter grades or numeric grades or whatever, if they take a course as pass-fail in the typical environment, the NCAA would award the lowest passing grade for that course. So that's usually a D at most schools. But when schools were transitioning to pass-fail in the spring, in this emergency remote environment, where some students weren't going to be able to finish because it was all sudden. Some students were, there were just different scenarios and different expectations. We realized it would probably be quite a hindrance to students if all of a sudden they got straight Ds if that wasn't where their academics were tracking. So this is where this update came into play. If a student's core course GPA would increase by assigning a value of 2.3, so I'll address why 2.3 in just a moment, then that value would be assigned to those past courses. If the student's core course GPA would decrease by assigning a value of 2.3, so essentially if they had been an A or B student and a 2.3 would lower their GPA, it would not be included in that GPA calculation, but it will still count toward those 16 courses. The 2.3 comes from those regular requirements that we talked about a couple slides ago, where a student needs to have at least a 2.3 GPA in those 16 core courses. So that's where that number comes from. But again, it will only be used if it helps. And if it lowers their GPA, then they will just get essentially the courses themselves counted, but they won't be part of the GPA calculation. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about the final component here, which is probably the most applicable to our topics today. So we've talked about all these requirements for how we review non-traditional core courses, but in response to COVID-19, one of the things that we are not doing is requiring a separate review of programs that are used in response to COVID-19. So for example, let's just play out a scenario so you can understand how it would be impossible basically to review these programs. So, if you are starting the school year and thinking we're going to do the first 2 weeks online and then the rest of our learning is going to be our typical either in-person or blended environment. Well, you start the first 2 weeks online, but then there is an outbreak in your community and you realize you can't return to your school in any type of blended way or in-person way. Well, that changes what that experience looks like for students. There's so much response and in the moment pivoting just from day to day and week to week that schools can't predict and districts can't predict right now what their program is going to look like next week, let alone at the end of this academic year. So our response right now is for you to implement, if you have NCAA approved core courses, implement them through the channel that makes the most sense for your population, in your community, in your school or district. We just can't expect people to go through our review process and tell us exactly what their student-teacher interaction is going to look like throughout the duration of the course, because you just don't know. It might vary. The mode might vary. the frequency, it might actually be more frequent than you would expect, than you would have expected. So we're not going to require separate reviews. Now, what I will tell you is if you are in a place where you had a learning model that has transitioned well to this environment and it hasn't been reviewed yet and you would like it reviewed, we still encourage you to submit those. So there's some folks weren't affected much by this current environment. If you are in a community where there's internet access and you already have a system in place to pivot to online, or it's fully online, and so you haven't experienced some of these hiccups, we're still reviewing those. We still get those types of submissions and we're still reviewing them. So this is really for the sort of emergency hybrid type of scenario that we're not requiring reviews for. Okay, on the next, well, actually, let me pause there and see if anyone has any questions about any of the COVID-19 updates before we move on.
Yeah, feel free to type any questions in the chat. I really like the comments that just came in from Suzanne Thompson, and I like how many factors are considered for reviews based on varying situations. So the job that you have is incredibly complex. Thank you for what you're doing. I know that when you look at all of these different models too, like thinking about what makes a quality learning experience where you know that student athletes will be prepared to go into a collegiate environment, the idea is that they need access to instructors. They know that they can have access to instruction or feedback or assessment. And that idea around, in our work that we do at Aurora, formerly INITIAL, really having evidence of student work and ensuring that that's at a college preparatory level too is so crucial. As well as the questions that came up before. So thank you. I don't see any questions coming in right now. We'll just pause for a second. Any other questions?
I will also, I mentioned this and then forgot to do it, I will add in the chat a link to the full set of FAQs related to these COVID-19 updates, because I know it's just kind of a lot of information to take in. So I will put that in the chat so that you can take a look at your leisure and have that for reference. And those continue to be updated. So as new things happen, as we encounter new scenarios or new places where we need to have a response or develop a waiver for certain situations, we're doing that in an ongoing way. We can go ahead and move on to the next slide then. And if you think of anything, feel free to keep dropping questions in the chat. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to talk about just what's next. We've had to create all these sort of updates and changes in response to COVID-19, but some of these things that we're seeing in education and just trends that we've been seeing over the past several years are going to affect where we're headed, right? They're going to affect the future of education. Even just the workplace has been vastly affected. Krista, Kaylin, and I used to work in an office in downtown Indianapolis, and we've been home for, in our respective homes for 6 months, working there. So everything has kind of changed a little bit, and just the nature of what school and work and life is going to look like moving forward. It won't go back. It won't be the same. No matter what it will look like, it won't be what it was. So as we think about what that means for the work that we do in reviewing these programs and in ensuring that students are ready for college work, we are just taking a revisit to what our legislation looks like. And is it still serving the purpose that it was intended to 10 years ago? So when I talked about sort of the history and background of that legislation itself, it was kind of on a 10-year pattern. So around 2000, not allowed, essentially banning any type of what we would call non-traditional courses. At that time, the view was very limited. Then about 10 years later, there was a response to the popularity of non-traditional courses, and the NCAA started saying, well, yeah, we should probably be open to this innovation, because otherwise we're going to shut out lots of opportunities for students. And then about 10 years later, there was this response to, gosh, if we allow too much, if we open the door too much, then there might be people who take advantage of this, and we need to have some type of guardrails to ensure that students are actually college ready. It's the intent is for them to be college ready. So we don't want them to click through a course or to fly through a course and not have any evidence of learning outcomes. So there were some additional guardrails put in place. Well, now, 10 years later, we're kind of doing some revisiting of that and listening to folks in the field, engaging with educational organizations like Aurora, and just trying to understand what's new, what's different, and how do we need to respond in order to, again, uphold this expectation of college readiness while also not limiting innovation. So on the next slide, we're going to just hear from you all. So this was why we practiced the annotate feature earlier. So again, on your Zoom screen, go to View Options, select Annotate. We're going to go through each of these items one at a time. So just pick your stamp, and then as I read each one, you'll have a chance to respond there. So when you're thinking about, and you can kind of adjust this because I know we have some various roles here in the audience today. So when you're thinking about designing or implementing a high school academic course or program, so if it's non-traditional, fine, but this could apply to really any type of academic course or program. How important is each of the following? So we'll go through these one by one. So for the first one, equitable access to technology. So use your stamp and put that in which of those categories you feel. All right, definitely a consensus there. Okay, we can go ahead and clear that one, and then we'll take a look at the next item. So again, when designing or implementing a high school academic course, how important is availability of professional development? All right, very good. Also, lots of folks have the very important response there. I have a feeling that we might end up with most of the responses in there. This one is an interesting one to me too, though, because even if you don't have formalized professional development, just over the last several years, there's so much available now that is accessible online or through workshops. And now that basically everything is moving to the virtual environment, there's so many free virtual things that people can sort of almost design their own professional development. So even if your school or district or group doesn't coordinate it, that might still be available to you. Okay, we can go ahead and clear that one. And then how important is student-to-student interaction? All right, a little more of a mix there. And then we'll obviously go through some other types of interactions. I'm curious to see what that looks like. So if we clear that one. How about student-to-teacher interaction? All right, more consistent there among the audience. And if we clear that one. How about student-to-content interaction? Excellent, thank you. And we can clear that one. And then as you're, oh, that's good. Depends if they choose. I like the free form. We're gonna follow up here in a little bit. So as you're thinking through these, you can either drop comments in the chat, or I'll also give you an opportunity after we get through these to just share any thoughts that you have about why you answered in a different way, or what your thought process was. So for the next one, guidelines from school or district leaders. Good, a little bit of a mix there as well. We can clear that one. How about support from colleagues? All right, I'm also curious to hear from some of you, again, as you're thinking through these, curious to hear if you feel like support from colleagues is more important than specifically professional development or vice versa. So just be noodling on that. And then if we can clear that one, we'll get to the last item here. Developing meaningful assessments. That one's a little bit open to interpretation, but however you interpret it. All right, great, thank you. We can go ahead and clear that. And then I'm curious, so again, you can drop comments in the chat, or you can, if you're brave and willing to unmute yourself and share with us. I'm curious to hear if you have just any additional thoughts. I'm especially curious if you feel like about the colleagues and professional development one, if one is more important or you think of those in the same realm. And I'm also curious how you interpreted meaningful assessments. Okay, that's great. That's good feedback from, is it Susan or Suzanne? I'm not sure, but for the student-to-student interaction, doesn't see student-to-student as vital. So they do well without that. So they're very connected or interacting in other ways, it sounds like. Yeah, good comment from Susan about the meaningful assessment. So performance assessments that yield student performance or evidence of work. Definitely the evidence of work is a big one. And then, oh, good comment from Joe. Professional development is the baseline. So colleague interaction is important for improvement and consistency. Definitely, I think probably all of us who were teachers in another life who are on staff now understand that concept of just, you know, having a team of teachers that you bounce ideas off of and sort of calibrate what you're doing. From Jeff, meaningful assessment both informs the teacher of the student's progress and provides the student feedback on their learning and how they can continue to grow. It's more than just a hammer. That's really, really good. So it's about two-way feedback, right? About the student being able to get feedback about how they're progressing, but also being able to give feedback to the teacher. And then there has to be an outcome from that, right? Where if I'm gathering this feedback, then how do I use it to then inform the future learning? Really, really great. This is extremely helpful feedback for us, again, as we think about just, like Krista mentioned, there's a lot of us on staff who are former educators, and we stay in touch through things like this with what's going on in the education field. But the further we get away from practicing it ourselves, the more we need to make conscious efforts to get this type of feedback from you all, so that, again, we understand how it's impacted by the work we're doing or how it impacts the work we're doing. So this is very, very valuable to us, and I really, really appreciate your engagement today. And I think we might have a couple of other final slides here. Oh, I forgot that we had this slide. So like I mentioned, we'll continue to monitor the environment, just the existing environment of the pandemic, and make necessary adjustments to prioritize health, safety, and fairness. But then we also are just continuing to evaluate our policies, procedures, and practices as the landscape of education shifts. So thinking about what we're learning now that will then inform what the future of education looks like. So we stay in obviously close touch with the high school review committee that guides our work, with the NCAA research staff. They have tons of data that they collect on incoming and then ongoing progress toward degree of student athletes once they get into college. We stay in close touch with education groups and policymakers, and then obviously, like I said, practitioners and those of you in the field engaged in this work, and we're so grateful that you also engage with us. It's really important to the work that we do.
Well, Sarah, we're grateful that you're willing to come and ask these questions as the field is changing dramatically from year to year. I know at our conference, which is usually in person, even the sessions and the presentations on what schools are doing and what districts are doing from 10 or 15 years ago, much less like 3 to 5 years ago, it changes dramatically every year. And the fact that you make such an effort to come to interact with practitioners in the field that are leading this work and just have such an open but analytical and thoughtful mindset in how you come into it. I just want to open up for any last questions. Feel free to type in the chat. I haven't seen any more questions come in. And I just want to thank everyone for participating today and remind people that this recording, this is recorded and it will be archived and available for sharing. There are lots and lots of people that are asking to be able to asynchronously participate. So we appreciate that you have come forward and provided such a clear, detailed, easily understandable for which are what are very complex issues with the Eligibility Center work and the high school review process. I feel like we all gained an understanding. So thank you to Sarah, Krista, and Kaylin for spending time together and allowing us to interact with you and provide feedback. We're always here to help and bring together educators, practitioners working in the field to help respond to any questions that you might have on how the field is developing. So thank you. Thanks to all of you for participating. Really appreciate the interactive nature of today's session. And feel free, on the next slide, we'll show you, we'll type it in the chat. Please respond to our 1-minute survey about this webinar by clicking on the link. And we really value your feedback and appreciate your comments for us. We hope you'll come back and join us again. On the next slide, we'll show you, we have a steady arc of additional pre-conference sessions and webinars leading up to the symposium on October 26th through 28th. Everything from competency-based, personalized, online and blended professional development for teachers to how do you do student high school internships in the workplace in the time of COVID. We're seeing really innovative work in virtual work-based learning. So it's just amazing to see the energy and the creativity that's in the school right now. How different schools are using flex time, changing their schedules, and digging deep around different forms of meaningful assessment and performance assessment. So much more to come. Last thanks to the NCAA team. Thank you again for being so responsive and open. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thank you. Take care and be well.